The Birth of the Self of Kierkegaard. Modern existence philosophy begins with Kierkegaard. There are no existence philosophers on whom his influence would not be traceable. Kierkegaard himself sets out consciously from a critique of Hegel. In other words, Kierkegaard starts from the forlornness of the individual in the completely explained world. The individual finds himself in a permanent contradiction to this explained world, since his existence, namely the pure factual character of his existing in all its contingency, that precisely I am and I no one else, and that precisely I am rather than am not, can be neither foreseen by reason nor resolved into something purely thinkable. Since Kierkegaard held fast to his despair with philosophy, he has become so much the more important for for the later development of philosophy. Philosophy has taken over from him all its new concrete contents. These are essentially the following: death as guarantee of the principium individuationis, since death as the most common of occurrences nevertheless strikes me unavoidably alone. Contingency as guarantee of reality as only given, which overwhelms and persuades me precisely through its incalculability and irreducibility to thought. Guilt as the category of all human activity, which is wreaked not upon the world, but upon itself. Insofar as I always take responsibilities upon myself, which I cannot overlook, and am compelled through my decisions themselves to neglect other activity. Guilt is thus the mode and the manner in which I myself, for example, become real, plunge into reality.
The self as all and nothing. Heidegger's attempt, despite and against Kant, to re-establish an ontology led to a far-reaching alteration of the traditional philosophical terminology. Thus, Heidegger's attempt to find a new foundation for metaphysics ends consistently with a small brochure, What is Metaphysics?, in which it is quite consistently shown, despite all tricks and sophistries of speech, that being in the Heideggerian sense is the nothing. If we look at the problem of the nothing in our context of a philosophy revolving against philosophy as per contemplation, then we see it as an effort to become master of being, and thereby to question philosophical in such a manner that we progress immediately to the deed. Thus, the thought that being is really the nothing has a tremendous advantages. In the characterizing of being as nothing there is, finally, the attempt to get away from the definition of being as the given and to transform the activities of man from being godlike to being divine. This is also the real reason why in Heidegger the nothing suddenly becomes active and begins to nothing. The nothing tries, so to speak, to reduce to nothing the givenness of being and to put itself in being's place.
Heidegger maintains that he has found a being in whom essence and existence are immediately identical, and this is man. His essence is his existence. The substance of man is not mind, but existence. Man has no substance. The important thing is that he is. One cannot ask after man's what as after the what of a thing, but only after his who. Man as the identity of existence and essence appeared to give a new key to the question concerning being in general.
Man's being is characterized as being in the world, and what is at stake for this being in the world is, finally, nothing else than to maintain himself in the world.
Within the framework of this philosophy, the self falls into the following way. As being in the world, man has not made himself, but has been thrown into his being. He seeks to escape from the condition of being thrown through the project which always anticipates death as his most extreme possibility. But in the structure of being thrown, as in the project, there lies essentially a nothingness.
In other words, the character of man's being is essentially determined by what he is not, his nothingness. The only thing the self can do to become a self is to take upon itself resolutely this factual character of its being, so that in its existence it is the void ground of its nothingness. In the resoluteness to become what man on the basis of his nothingness cannot be, namely a self, man recognizes that human reality as such and guilty the being of man in such that perpetually falling to the world, it perpetually hears the cry of consciousness from the ground of its being.
Jaspers achieved his break with the traditional philosophy in his Psychology der Weltanschauung, where he represents and relativizes all philosophical systems as mythologizing structures, in which man, seeking protection, flees before the real questions of his existence. From these extreme situations, he seeks to project a new type of philosophizing, in which he invokes Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. This new philosophizing will, above all, teach nothing. It will be rather a perpetual shaking up, a perpetual appeal to the powers of life in oneself and others. In this manner, Jaspers places himself in the revolt, fundamental to the new philosophy of the philosophers against philosophy. Existence is for Jaspers no form of being, but a form of human freedom, and indeed the form in which man, as possibility of his spontaneity, turns against his mere being a result. Man's being as such and as given is not existence, but is in his human reality possible existence. Thus, the word existence expresses the meaning that only insofar as man moves in the freedom that rests upon his own spontaneity and is directed in communication to the freedom of others, is there reality for him. We become aware of being by a process of thought which proceeds from the illusory world of the thinkable to the limits of reality, which is no longer to be grasped as pure object of thought or pure possibility. This bringing oneself in thought to the limits of the thinkable, Jaspers calls transcending.
In Jaspers, thinking has the function of leading man to determinate experience, in which thought itself, though not the thinkable man, fails. In the foundering of thought and not of the man, man who is more than thought, because more real and more free, experiences what Jaspers calls the cipher of transcendence. That transcendence is experienced as a cipher only in foundering, is itself a sign of existence, which is aware not only that as human reality, it has not created itself, and that as human reality, it is helplessly surrendered to inevitable destruction, but also that even as freedom, it is not indebted to itself alone. The transcendence is experienced in failure is a sign of the limitation of human existence. In this failure, man experiences the fact that he can neither know nor create being, and that thus he is not God. In this experience, he realizes the limitation of his existence, the limits of which he tries to trace in philosophizing. In the failing transcendence of all limits, he experiences reality given to him as the cipher of a being which he himself is not.
The task of philosophy is to free man from the illusory world of the pure object of thought, and let him find his way home to reality. Philosophic thought can never cancel the fact that reality cannot be resolved into the thinkable. Its job is rather to aggravate this unthinkability. The limits of human freedom are traced out in the extreme situations in which man experiences the limitations which immediately become the conditions of his freedom and the ground of his activity. Proceeding from them, he can eliminate his existence, trace out what he can and he cannot do, and thereby from mere being as a result, pass to existence, which in Jaspers is only another and more explicit word for being a man. By way of summary, existence itself is never essentially isolated. It exists only in communication and in the knowledge of the existence of others. One's fellow men are not an element which, though is structurally necessary, nevertheless destroys existence. But on the contrary, existence can develop only in the togetherness of men in the common given world. In the concept of communication, there lies embedded, though not fully developed, a new concept of humanity as the condition for man's existence. Though the essentially human movement of transcendence through thought and of the failure of thought bound up with this, we at least arrive at the conclusion that man, as master of his thoughts, not only is more than any of his thoughts, and this would probably be the fundamental condition for a new definition of human dignity, but that from the first man's nature is to be more than himself and to will more than himself. With this, existence philosophy has left the period of its egoism. That's all. Thank you for listening.